everyone, or good morning wherever you are. Thanks for joining us today. We're here today to talk about employees are ready to quit. Is your retention strategy ready? My name is Nelms. I'm the president of the Work Institute, and I will be your presenter today. So we're very excited that you've joined us, and this is a hot topic right now. So I expect that we're going to get some questions from you. I certainly hope so. The operator probably told you we're going to use the chat button in order for you to ask questions, and please feel free to do that throughout the presentation. And I'll be happy to pause and answer some questions, and certainly that makes everything a little more interesting to find out what's actually going on with you, the participant, and find out what's going on in your organization. So I hope that you will take advantage of asking some questions as we move along. Kind of the topics for today, we're going to hit a couple of things, and we're not going to spend a ton of time on each of them, but we're going to talk a little bit about the state of the U.S. workforce and really talking specifically about retention and turnover. We'll talk about those foundational pieces for building a retention strategy. We're going to talk a little bit about exit interviews and making former employees your consultants. We're going to talk about the stay interview. We're going to talk a little bit about employee voice, and this is sort of an old concept that needs to become new. So tools for a new approach and then changing the game. So get ready because here we go. You know, the state of the turnover in the U.S. is interesting. As the U.S. economy grows and job creation accelerates, workforce retention is becoming an increasingly significant issue for employers. And we are actually seeing this in all the data that's out there. CEOs are becoming highly concerned about talent management and about talent retention. They are feeling the pressures, and here's why that is the case. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually releases this data every month, and so I want to kind of show you what the factors are that are creating all of this workforce tension, and I would even call it turbulence to a certain degree. So what you have here is a graphic over the last 10 years or so, and what we're looking at is the shaded area is obviously when the U.S. economy went through a recession, and then what we're seeing here is job openings, and that's kind of the dark bluish purple line. We're seeing the number of hires that are occurring in the U.S. economy, and then we're seeing the quit rate, and this is the voluntary turnover rate, if you will, in the U.S. economy. So what's interesting here is that the number of job openings, it is at the highest point that it's ever been in the U.S. We have over 5 million job openings, and that's actually been updated from this number in January of 15, and the May numbers were even bigger. So we have over 5 million open jobs in the U.S. right now. So, and that's the highest in history, at least as far back as the Bureau of Labor Statistics data goes. So we have a ton of opportunity in this country in terms of job openings. So we're trying to hire to keep up, and we're seeing a little bit of that in terms of the hiring rate. But as you can see, the job opening rate is growing at a faster rate than we can hire folks. And so we see this interesting intersection that's starting to occur in that for the first time in, 10 years, at least in a couple of months, we saw that we actually had more job openings and less hires. And so this is going to become a real critical issue for companies in the U.S. It simply means that we need to hire at a faster rate than we have more job openings and need to hire at a faster rate than we can actually hire people. And then, of course, what you see below that is the quit rate, the voluntary turnover rate. And as you can see, back in 06 and 07, that was really the highest point that we had seen over about a 15-year period. And we are quickly approaching that same number. So although this economic recovery has been somewhat slow and steady, from a workforce perspective, we have seen pressures unlike we haven't seen before. And so what we are expecting and what all the experts are expecting is that this quit rate is going to continue to climb, and it's probably going to start to spike over the next 6 to 12 months. As companies are feeling the pressure, of these job openings and not being able to hire at a fast enough rate, they're going to get aggressive. They're going to get aggressive for everything, to pay, to benefits, to start. I remember the time back in the early 2000s when signing bonuses were common. We are probably going to see all of those things come back, and that employers are going to have to pull out all the stops in order to hire qualified talent to bring into their organization. And what's going to happen to everyone else is that we're going to be in the talent war that we've been talking about for decades. And companies are going to see enormous pressure to both hire people, but they're going to feel the pressure internally to retain their employees and retain their top talent. So I actually wrote a blog about this probably 3 weeks ago, and I talked about this being the perfect storm. So, if you remember the movie The Perfect Storm, if any of you have seen that before, you remember that there were 3 systems that all came together simultaneously to create a storm like we'd never seen in the Northeast. And that's the way I look at these statistics. I look at these numbers and I say, this is the perfect storm coming as it relates to the workforce. And these statistics tell us that there is indeed 3 different pieces of the puzzle that are coming together to cause employers significant challenges in both finding talent and keeping talent in their business. So the question is, how do we build a retention strategy in order to keep our best employees? And Jack Welch talked about there are only 3 measurements that tell you nearly everything you need to know about your organization's performance: employee engagement, customer satisfaction, and cash flow. It goes without saying that no company, small or large, can win over the long run without energized employees who believe in the mission and understand how to achieve it. And I say this because one of the things that people really don't think about as it relates to employee engagement is that the same thing that drives engagement drives retention. Okay, the factors are exactly the same, and I've done entire presentations on this subject, and so I don't want to go off too far on that tangent. But the same things that we have to do to engage our employees are the exact same things that we have to do in order to retain employees. So when we're talking about engagement, we're talking about retention. When we're talking about retention, we're talking about engagement. And so I think you have to get that mindset in terms of in your organization, and when you start to talk about either retention strategies or engagement strategies, they don't need to be separate subjects. They need to be one and the same, because the same things are going to drive both. And so as we're going through this presentation today, and as we're talking about this, I want you to keep that mindset that every time we talk about turnover, every time we talk about retention, we're also talking about employee engagement. So what's interesting to me is that I hear all the time. I speak around the country. I'm out talking to potential clients or current clients of the Work Institute, and everybody always says, well, I need to build my retention strategy. And the first thing they tend to do is to build a retention committee, or in some cases they have an engagement committee. So they bring some people internally together to talk about how they need to develop their retention strategy. And although that's well and good, because you certainly need to have key players who are supporting the efforts of the organization related to retention, I would say that they're starting at the wrong place. Because typically what happens is you get a group of folks together, key individuals in the organization, and you start talking about what you think is causing turnover in your organization. And so everybody brings their ideas. So somebody will say, well, we're not paying enough, or we're not training enough, or people are just leaving because they don't want to work, or they're leaving because they're going to other jobs that are paying more money. The reasons are sort of nonstop. And what's interesting to me is that there are ways for us to find out why, in fact, employees are leaving. And so from an evidence basis, okay, and we'll talk at the end of this more about evidence-based, but from an evidence basis, in order to solve a problem, you first need to know what the problem is. And the only way we can really know what the problem is to get feedback from our employees, to completely assess the reasons why people are leaving. We can't start to develop a retention strategy if we don't know what's truly causing it. And the only people that know truly why they left are employees. And we seem to leave that element out in terms of trying to figure out what we're going to do to retain employees. We make assumptions. We make assumption after assumption after assumption. We do guesswork. We spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions of dollars in large organizations to put some kind of retention strategy in place when we don't know exactly what we are trying to do as it relates to why people are leaving. So the first thing we have to do is to figure out why people have left. And we have to recognize that those people that have left are in fact a sample of those people inside that are considering leaving. And in fact, they're a pretty good sample of your organization as a whole. So those exiting employees are going to be very similar to those that are considering leaving and are getting opportunities or getting recruiters' calls, are on the job boards, or doing all those things. And so they can actually tell us a lot about why they're leaving and give us insight as to what we can do to try and retain those people that we currently have that actually may be considering leaving. We have to use intelligence to build a strategy. It doesn't need to be from the top down, if you will, in terms of what we think we need to do. We need to know what we need to do. So we need to know why it is that employees are leaving, and in some cases why employees are staying, and we'll talk about stay interviews in a few minutes as well. But we have to have the facts, and the only place that we can go to get the facts are from the employees themselves. Either why are they staying or why are they leaving? That gives us the foundational, solid information that we need to know in order to build an effective retention strategy. I think sometimes we actually try and make it more complicated than it is. You know, anytime you throw the word strategy at the end of anything, I think we think about complexity. We think about, oh, we need this massive, robust strategy, and it's 25 pages of document after document. The reality is that it isn't that complicated. If we can truly identify the reasons why people are leaving and truly identify the reasons why people are staying, then we can strengthen the positives, reinforce the positives, and we can remediate the negatives. We can remediate the reasons why people are leaving. And it's no big secret. It's not overly complicated. Now, is it easy to do? No, it's not easy to do. If it was easy, nobody would have turnover in their organization. So it is a challenge to remediate those issues, but if we don't know what they actually are, we have no chance in order to remediate them effectively. So let's talk a little bit about the exit interview process. Let's talk about how we truly create former employees as workforce consultants, as we would call it. And there's a few things that you need to consider. You know, there's some exit interview must, and too often what I see and what we see is that exit interviews are treated too much like an event and not enough like a process and a strategy, okay? We allow everyone to just have the opportunity to take their exit interview, and sometimes we look at the data, sometimes we don't. Oftentimes it's just kept with a single person that actually conducts the exit interview, and it's not populated across the organization. So there's a lot of things around exit interviews that need to be looked at as a process and a strategy, not just an event. So whenever we're conducting exit interviews, the first thing we have to have is a clear goal. And that clear goal, based on what we're talking about today, is to help develop a clear and effective retention strategy. That's why we're doing exit interviews. We want to know the real reasons why people are leaving in order to develop and have an effective retention strategy. That is our goal. And ultimately our goal would then be to reduce turnover, or at least to maintain our turnover at a level that it is, or to try and slow it down beyond what maybe our competitors are feeling. So we have to have that clear goal. And then we have to have communication strategies. one of the things that we hear often is that response rates are poor. People don't respond to exit interviews. Well, there's a whole host of reasons, but the number one thing that affects people actually conducting an exit interview is communicating it effectively and making sure that it's important to the organization that former employees tell them about their experience and we give them a chance to tell us their story. So we have to have a communication strategy. We have to have a good sound questionnaire design. We see over and over and over again that there are poor questionnaires designed. There are leading questions. There are limiting questions. I see surveys where we have reasons for leaving and we have a drop-down menu. Well, how do we know that that's not just giving someone leading indicators as to why they would leave? We're putting ideas in their head as opposed to letting them tell us their story. So we need to make sure that we design our questionnaire properly in order to make sure that we're getting the best answers, the most accurate answers, and we're giving employees a chance to truly tell their story. And then we have to have data, okay? Again, one of the biggest challenges we see with companies that are coming to us and conducting exit interviews, they say, well, we've been doing them, but we don't have any data, that we don't have an organized way to look at it. We have no way of looking at trends. We do them paper pencil and they get stuck in an employee's file and nobody ever looks at it again. We need to have actual data that we can look at, and that starts with trying to say, what are the demographics that we need to look at? What do we need to look at this by job title? Do we need to look at it by ethnicity? Do we look at it by tenure? Do we look at it by key talent? All of those different factors can be given to an organization like the Work Institute and others out there as well that are competitors of ours, and we can then sort data based on that. And we'll talk about reporting in just a minute. And then we actually have to execute the research. We need to make sure that we are conducting the exit interviews properly, that we have people trained in how to conduct exit interviews, or we need to consider outsourcing those exit interviews to organizations who have that training in those questionnaires that are going to be able to get us the real information. And we're going to talk a little bit more about real versus not real in just a couple of minutes. If we do all those things right, then we're going to be able to have very detailed reporting and analysis, which is going to lead us to meaningful action planning around our retention strategy. So if we know what the real reasons why people are leaving are, we've collected that data, we have confidence in that data, then we can develop a true action plan related to building our effective retention strategy. So I want to talk a little bit about exit interviews and sort of internal versus external. Data tells us that about somewhere between 70 and 80% of all exit interviews are actually conducted by human resources. So HR is actually conducting the exit interview. And okay, so that's pretty common practice. The question is, are we actually putting all of the best practices in place if HR is going to conduct it? Why would you do it internally? Well, there's certainly the potential to retain an employee. So if you're interviewing them during their notice period, you may be able to find out an issue that you can correct, and you may be able to keep that employee. I don't think it happens a lot, but I think this is one of the biggest reasons why HR wants to conduct them, is that they want to be able to have a chance to personally look at that employee eye to eye. They want to be able to correct things quickly if they can, and maybe they want to turn that employee around and actually have them stay. Leaders may trust the data more, although I would argue that they shouldn't, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Leaders often have a high trust with their HR departments, so they're going to trust that the data is accurate because they just feel closer to it. They feel like someone they knew actually conducted the exit interview. It certainly is going to be more cost-effective than outsourcing, and certainly employees may perceive it as a high-touch approach. You know, they're meeting with someone that they know. They certainly it has a high-touch, feeling to it, and certainly a good conversation can give the employee a chance to feel appreciated. So we can tell them thank you. We can tell them we appreciated all their efforts, you know, so on down the road. Now, I would argue that for a lot of smaller organizations, a lot of these may be positives and a lot of these are possible. As your organization gets larger and larger, these things get more and more difficult to execute on. Can we truly have a large enough HR staff to conduct exit interviews with everyone? Many organizations are scattered everywhere. I mean, we work routinely with companies that have 20, 30, 40, 50 locations scattered across the U.S., very large companies that are very diverse geographically, and so it gets more and more difficult to actually have a good process and to conduct that exit interview internally in order to create the kind of data that we want. So there are certainly a few reasons why we might want to consider outsourcing the exit interviews. And let me tell you about, I mentioned earlier, the real reasons why employees are leaving. One of our challenges is that we want to get the most authentic data. We want the truth, okay? And there's actually been blind research that's done with, a control group where an exit interview was conducted one way with the group and then it was conducted another way with the group, and we actually studied the differences in the responses. And one of two things that we found affect the authenticity of the data, first of all, is timing. Of those exit interviews, those 70 or 80% that are done through HR, about 90% of those then are conducted during that notice period. And again, I've mentioned the positives of doing it during the notice period might be that you're able to retain that employee. Certainly you get to make them feel appreciated. The problem is that if you conduct that exit interview 2 weeks after they've left, 40% of the reasons for leaving are going to be different. They're going to be more authentic. So why is that? Well, just put yourself in the shoes. Maybe you've left a job at some point. When you're still there, do you want to burn a bridge? Do you want to talk openly about the deficiencies of your supervisor? Do you want to talk openly about how you felt underappreciated? Do you want to talk openly about your coworkers? Do you want to talk openly about how you felt that you were undervalued and underpaid? No, we have a tendency to want to be nice, okay? We want to be nice, and so we sort of sugarcoat things on the way out when we're talking to our supervisor or talking to HR. And so, we say, well, we're leaving for personal reasons. I want to be able to be a little closer to home, and I'm going to have a shorter commute, or I want to be able to expand my career. It's going to be better for me being somewhere else because there's going to be more opportunity. And all those are real reasons, and often those come out. Unfortunately, what we see over and over again is that companies will submit to us their reason for leaving that they were given by the employee, and when we conduct the exit interview, we find that it's another reason that was the true driver in why they left. So they say that it was the commute. The reality was it was the supervisor. They say that they left for a career opportunity. The reality is that it was a pay issue. And what we have to know is the truth, okay? The other factor is, do you do it inside or do you do it outside? So a similar controlled group study was done where the exit interview was conducted by HR versus the exit interview conducted by a third-party consultant. And in this case, it wasn't a company. It was just an outside consultant who conducted the exit interview. Again, 40% of the reasons for leaving changed. So put those two together. If we are conducting an exit interview internally and we're conducting it, for instance, on their last day work, 80% of the information we're getting might be inaccurate, or at least it may not be the most important things that were driving the employee's decision to move to their next job. So if we're trying to build an effective retention strategy, the first thing we need to do is build it on facts. We need to build it on data that we can trust. Now, I mentioned that, your leadership may trust the data more when you're doing it internally, but that's an emotional response. It's an emotional response to the fact that I trust my HR professional. I trust my HR professional to talk to that departing employee and get the truth. And I've been in HR for 20 years. I know that feeling. I feel like I can get the truth out of them. I just don't think that that's always true. I think we like to think it, but research tells us differently. So if I'm going to build a retention strategy based on facts, I need to consider how I'm going to conduct my exit interview. If you outsource them, it's going to definitely be more consistent. The interviews are conducted more routinely. There's a consistent interview that takes place. We're able to build all that into a reporting system where you can actually get that information and look at it and look at the trends and look at the actual information in a more organized way. It's not just sitting in an employee file somewhere. And the reality is it actually might be more cost effective. So if a generalist is conducting an exit interview and it takes them an hour to set it up and then actually conduct the exit interview and then do something with the data after the fact, they could be taking easily an hour, and that's $24, and that's not even loaded for benefits and all those things. So it's probably costing us $30 to $40 an hour for that HR generalist to conduct them. So oftentimes you can start to compare that against outsourced solutions, and you find that you're going to spend no more money. You might spend the same amount of money, and you're actually going to get better quality data. And certainly there's all the additional time for the administration of the system. So that's why you would want to think about doing them externally. So you have to make a choice in terms of how am I going to get data to build my retention strategy, and our exit interview is going to be a part of that. And I would argue that they absolutely need to be. This is going to give us the real reasons why people are leaving, and so we have to have that as part of our retention strategy. It's where it all starts, okay? Just a couple of things. Oftentimes because the Work Institute actually conducts exit interviews, a lot of people would say, well, that's just self-serving. Well, we didn't conduct the research, although we have confirmed it. This was academic research conducted in an academic setting. And then there's some more folks out there talking about it. So, the best time to do an exit interview is anywhere from 1 month up to a year after the person has left their position. This is because it gives the former employee time to gain a more objective and less emotional perspective. And that's from Getty's Trillium with Team Zine. Georgetown University, the only real disadvantage to employers might be the cost. Nothing else makes the cons list. You have a higher probability of getting a trained interviewer. They can gather systematic data, and employees are likely to be honest, more likely to be honest and cooperative. So we're not the ones saying this. This is other experts in the field that are talking about the reasons why you would want to outsource exit interviews. Okay. Now, another topic around that we want to talk about is the stay interview. And this is obviously starting to get a lot of press time. Stay interviews were really became a popular topic about 5 years ago, 6 years ago. There was a gentleman by the name of Dick Finnegan who wrote a book called The Power of Stay Interviews. I know Dick. We've met several times out on the quote speaking circuit. I think he's got some real good ideas around stay interviews. We take a different approach, quite frankly, and I'll tell you more about that. But let's face it, stay interviews are becoming quickly a mainstay of how we want to look at retention. And the question is, those departing employees can't really tell us why they stay because they've left, okay? So how are we going to understand what the strengths are? Why is it that people are staying? And putting those two pieces of the puzzle together are going to really help us in our retention strategy, because we can then know what are the strengths, okay? What are the strengths that are keeping people here, so we can really know what to re-emphasize with our organization, and what are the opportunities based on why people are actually leaving. And so we have the exit interview in order to give us that data. And stay interviews are sort of an interesting concept from the standpoint of, I believe they have become so popular because I think they're actually taking the place of something that we should be doing that we typically don't. And I don't have the proof of this. All I have is literally dozens and dozens of conversations that I've had with HR professionals. Most of us are very familiar with our performance management process, and it's tied to compensation, it's tied to all these different things. And so we go through the performance review process once a year, and we look back. We look back and we say, how did they perform over the last year? And the goal is to then figure out what we're going to pay them an increase and how we're going to compare them against their objectives that they were given. But the most important part of the performance review is to talk about how can we continue to grow and develop. What's next? What's going to happen in terms of developing you over the future? And it's typically talked about as a development plan, and the development plan is part of the performance management process. Well, again, I speak all over the country, and I'm usually in a room with 30, 40, 100 people, and I ask them to raise their hands if, in fact, they feel that the development plan becomes a central part of the performance management process. And usually about 10 or 15 of the folks in the room, about 10% will raise their hands. It's the part that doesn't get done. It doesn't get the attention. And so the reason why I believe stay interviews, especially the stay interview as Dick presents it, is that it is geared towards having that development conversation, having that conversation about why am I excited about my job, what's next in my job, what am I going to be learning, how am I going to develop, where is my career going with this company. Those are all extraordinarily important things, and they're things that should be happening on a regular basis. And if, in fact, those are not happening, then I highly encourage you to build an internal stay interview process, okay? Those conversations need to be happening between manager and employee all the time. And let's face it, they don't. 50% of them, when we talk to employees about would you work for your manager again or your supervisor, 50% of the time they say no. No, I would not work for my supervisor or manager again. What does that tell us about 50% of the managers in this country? It tells me that they're pretty ineffective. So we need to put more tools in place to make them more effective. So we have to be able to understand the risk related to retention and engagement. And so this stay interview is going to give us information related to why are people staying, but it's also going to give us an understanding of what are the risks. It also provides us a pulsing mechanism. So these stay interviews should be ongoing. We should do them once, twice, 3 times a year. And that way we're getting ongoing conversations, ongoing information. It should create qualitative data that surveys typically don't. Typically, a company is going to do an engagement study once a year, and they're going to get a lot of survey data. They're going to get a lot of quantitative data, but they don't really have a lot of the whys. They don't really know why their supervisors are not really being seen as effective. They don't know why their total rewards are not seen as effective. They don't really know why people don't see career opportunities in the company. And those are the things that the stay interview can fill in the blanks around. When we ask the right questions, we're going to be able to fill in that information. So we need to make sure that we're using multiple forms of employee feedback. So the exit interview, the stay interview, the engagement study. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. And again, I go back to this engagement model. The engagement drivers are really about team and manager and organization, and emotional commitment is about the job and the team and the manager and the organization. And both of those things drive that discretionary effort and that intent to stay. So that's what we're driving at. What can we do that's going to drive engagement and drive intent to stay? And so the exit interviews and the stay interviews are a way for us to gather the data that's necessary in order to build an effective retention and engagement strategy. So just real quickly, I want to talk a little bit about the key elements of the stay interview. We need to be addressing intent to stay. We need to be looking at what are the barriers to job performance and job satisfaction. We need to look at potential supervisor concerns. Are there compliance issues? Are there career opportunities? Are there development needs out there? Are there recent changes in the organization that we need to get at? Work-life balance issues, culture issues, reward concerns, staffing concerns. We're hearing a lot about the fact that people are having to do what they perceive as 2 people's jobs, and that's a real demotivator in the organization. So then it becomes a question of, well, is it best to do the stay interview inside versus outside? Well, it comes down to this. You might need to be doing them both, but if you're going to do them inside, then I think they probably need to be part of that development process. however you want to create it. If you want to create it as part of your performance management process, great. You just have to ensure that it happens. And if it's not happening, then I would urge you to train your managers on how to conduct a stay interview, or call it a development interview, or call it a check-in interview. I don't really care what we call it, and that's sort of irrelevant. It's about the event. It's about how do we create meaningful conversations between manager and employee. It's certainly going to build trust. It can be individualized, and there's certainly an opportunity to address issues immediately between the manager and the employee. But are there some circumstances where we want to do it outside? Well, let's face it, go back to that stat. 50% of employees would not work for their supervisor again. So what is that relationship like between that manager and that employee? So are we going to find out the truth about the issues that are facing that employee? So if we do them outside, there's certainly the potential to be more candid. They're more likely to address the supervisor's issues. Interviews can be standardized. What we find a lot of times is internal stay interviews are real sporadic. One manager conducts them one way, another manager conducts them a different way. And so the data is not consistent, or it's non-existent. Excuse me. Because they don't really have a good tool to enter that data into so that we can go back and look at it and try and figure out if there are trends across the organization in terms of things that we are or are not doing in order to create a highly retained workforce. So it's going to certainly ensure that the interviews take place. There are not as many reasons why stay interviews need to be done outside versus inside as there are with exit interviews. But if companies are having real struggles with retention, I would argue that we need to do all three things. We need to do exit interviews, we need to do external stay interviews, and we need to start to train our managers on how to have more meaningful development conversations or check-in conversations, whatever we want to call them. So those are all extremely important. So again, I go back to the beginning. How are we going to build an effective retention strategy? It starts with data. It starts with the fact that we need to have exit interviews, we potentially need to have stay interviews, we need to have effective ways to collect that data, we need to be able to organize that data in meaningful ways, we need to be able to look at it, we need to look at trends, we need to look at how do we as an organization effectively address retention and engagement in our organization. And I want to just reinforce that with a concept that we've known about for years, but I think it's starting to get lost a little bit. And that's the concept of employee voice. In times of uncertainty, it's more important than ever that employers pay attention to the concept called employee voice. Why? It can enhance workplace productivity through its impact on engagement, creativity, retention, and effectiveness. And what do I mean by that? Well, employer voice refers to the participation of employees in influencing organizational decision-making, okay? Unfortunately, engagement in this country has been stagnant for 25 or 30 years. It still sits at that 25, 30, 35% range in terms of the number of employees or percentage of employees that are highly engaged. And the other 70% of our employees are highly disengaged or they're sitting on the fence, okay? And many times what we think is that we're just simply not truly giving employees a voice. They don't feel like they are getting to participate. People want to be a part of something. They want to be members of a community. They want to be part of something great and something good. I would argue that people want to do a great job. They come to work wanting to do good things. And oftentimes our organization creates barriers to that occurring. And if we can truly give employees a voice in the organizational decision-making, then we are doing something extraordinary, because companies typically don't do this and don't do it very well. Now, there's a couple of things that we have to keep in mind. Employees are given a voice through informal and formal means. So we're talking about formal means with exit interviews and stay interviews. Employee participation is a form of empowerment and motivation that leads to productivity and retention. But one of the things that we need to realize is that we have to make sure that, in fact, we are acting on that voice. A large body of evidence shows that the involvement of workers in enhancing productivity increases both the earnings of workers and the competitive of the products that they produce. Okay? If we listen to our employees, they're going to end up making more money because the company is going to make more money. We're going to be more competitive. If we listen to employees, it'll provide solutions to the challenges that the organization faces. Employees are the best source of information that we have, and we simply don't choose to listen to it. Embedding a culture of voice ensures openness and transparency. It's already operating in every organization, and the voice is the best guard against reputational risk. Now, one of the things that we have to do is consider expectancy theory, and I don't really have a slide on this, but employees expect when they participate, when they provide you their voice, it doesn't matter whether it's an exit interview, a stay interview, a pulse interview, an engagement study, an onboarding interview, it doesn't matter. What they want to know is, did they listen? Did they hear what I said? So one of the things we have to make sure we do is have a feedback mechanism in place where we can give employees feedback around what we've heard. Here's the good things we've heard. Here's the not so good things we've heard. Here's what we're going to be doing in the short term. And we need to have a coordinated effort to give employees feedback on all of the ways in which we ask them to give us information. It doesn't matter whether it's in the onboarding process, in the engagement study, in the stay interview, in the exit interview. All of that information is when we have asked employees to give us information, and we need to acknowledge that we have heard, what we have seen, and what we plan to do about it. And so when you look at that, it really looks at, what is a tool for a new approach? What is it that we can do that would really help us to frame this in a proper way? And I want to throw out a model that we've started looking at here at the Work Institute, and it's this feedback loop. It's whether it's monthly pulse questions, our engagement study, our stay interviews, our exit interview, our new hire and onboarding study. This creates an organized way for employees to have a voice. There's a constant input from our employees at all stages of the employee life cycle. So there's this constant feedback loop. And I'm going to skip ahead a slide and then I'm going to come back. If we do that, then we can also put in place communication efforts. And so what you see here is these little marks that say, I think I have a way to draw. I'm going to do that. See here where we have the feedback loop. So what this says is that if you looked at this timeline and you said, here's January and here's December, and I'm just using this as an example, okay, then we are constantly talking to employees as they come on board. And then we have monthly pulse questions that we're asking along the way. We have an employee engagement study that happens at least once a year. And we have stay interviews that are happening periodically throughout the year. And we have an exit interview when they leave. And what we do is we put in place at certain times, so every March or April and every September or October, we create a feedback loop so that people can start to expect, I'm going to hear twice a year what it is that my company has heard from myself and my colleagues. What did they hear from exit interviews? What did they hear from the onboarding process? What did they hear in the engagement study? What were people that left saying? So this is a model that can start to develop a true organized employee voice, okay? And the whole goal is to drive retention and engagement. It's to give them a voice in order to drive that. And this is what feeds our engagement and retention strategy. It's all about data. This is where we get the data. It's where we get the information. It's where we learn what specifically to act on. And we need to do it in an organized fashion, and we need to have specific feedback loops that are organized and happen routinely so that employees are going to know exactly what it is that the company has heard and what it is that the company is going to do about it. And if we can start to do this effectively, we're going to change the game. Talent intelligence could be a key lever in today's hyper-competitive world. Business intelligence captures, extracts, and analyzes key data on an organization's traditional hard assets. Can't talk all of a sudden. Talent intelligence centers on the key data on its people assets to generate insights that can provide improved decision-making and performance. And you could easily replace retention and engagement for decision-making and performance. It gives us the evidence that we're looking for. I talked about that before. What is it that we use to drive evidence-based decisions? And typically we talk about that as what's the best available research, okay? What is the data? Where is the data that's going to tell us what it is we need to do? Now, data alone isn't all we need. We also need to say what's the expertise within the organization. So we know certain events or certain things are affecting our workers, so we have to add that to the equation. And we have to make sure that we're getting the whys. You know, have we given them a chance to truly tell their story? So we have what are the environmental issues, what's the practitioner knowledge, or what is the organizational knowledge, and what is it that the research is telling us about the employee experience. That is the data that's going to tell us how to build our retention and engagement strategy. And it sort of becomes this winding road, you know. We're doing our new hire, we're doing our pulsing questions, we have our feedback loops, we're doing our engagement study. It's never an easy direct path. It's not as simple as a timeline most of the time. But understanding employees' preferences, expectations, and intents is essential to eliminating the high cost of turnover, the expensive process of recruiting new hires, and the major issues that lead to dissatisfaction or disengagement in the workplace. This is going to be the data that helps us drive our true engagement and retention strategy. And I've been talking very fast, and unfortunately no questions have come up, and I really wish that some of them had, but I'm going to pause here and see if there are a few questions. You just simply need to click on the chat button and ask away. Surely we have one brave soul that's willing to ask one brave question. Can't be that hard. So one of the questions that I often get is, okay, so if I can only do one thing, if I can only do an engagement study, or if I can only do stay interviews, or I can only do exit interviews, you know, what am I going to choose? Well, it's a hard question. There is, you know, there's never a perfect answer, but I think the stay interview done externally is sort of my preference because it gives us the most opportunity to get the most authentic data we can. We can put it in a pulsing mechanism, and we can get feedback from those current employees. It's the one thing I would absolutely do. Certainly, as I've shared, there would be more things that I would do if I can, but this stay interview concept is really, really strong, and I would really encourage you to look at that and maybe even read Dick's book and certainly read some of the research that is out there. So we do have one question: how do I get my manager to buy into a new retention program? Well, again, it starts with data, and so, you know, the first thing I would do is take that first slide that I presented to everyone and say, you know, here's what's happening in the U.S. Now, we may not feel its effects today, but I think there's a good chance that almost every company in the U.S. is going to start feeling this, and they're going to feel the effects of this perfect storm that's coming on. So it starts with, here's the data, here's what we're facing, and then you have to support that with real data. So I want to do exit interviews. Okay, great, go to have your HR person do them. Well, I don't think I'm going to get the right information. Okay, we will have to give them actual factual information. This is what happens when we conduct them internally. This is what happens when we conduct them externally. So those are the things that we need to make sure that we're providing that are factual around getting our manager to buy into a new retention program. Someone said, do you have any statistics on the success of interviews for those that have left after 6 months or a year? The biggest challenge is getting them to respond after they've been gone for that long. Typically, a good exit interview program will have an offboarding process. where we'll actually talk to them as they're leaving about the fact that there's going to be an exit interview conducted within the next 2 to 3 weeks. There's certainly a strong indication that if we told them we were going to follow up with them in 6 months or a year, I think you would have a fairly good response rate. I don't know that the data is going to be dramatically different than it was 2 or 3 weeks after they've left. Unfortunately, there's been no research conducted on the difference between 2 weeks after they've left and 1 year after they've left. But certainly, we often encourage clients to go back in time when they start their program and try and go back as far as 3 months or 6 months or maybe as far as a year if they think they have good contact information. So unfortunately, there's just not any statistical data that's been conducted on the success of the exit interviews after 6 months or a year. Someone asked if the presentations were going to be able to view again. Yes, we'll be more than happy to send those out. There are often a number of organizational changes that the feedback may be too late. How would we make this impactful? Well, again, that gets back to the possibility of having this ongoing program with different types of feedback going on simultaneously. We need to be able to get, if we've got this, and I would call this a pulsing mechanism. So we have exit interviews that are ongoing. We have stay interviews that are ongoing. We have an engagement study that's happening once a year. We have stay interviews that are ongoing. So we have this constant feedback mechanism. And so even though the organization is changing quickly, we've always seen data. And one of the things that we're seeing in organizations is this data gets scattered all over the organization. You know, the recruiting department is responsible for onboarding, and the learning and development group is responsible for engagement, and the employee relations is responsible for the engagement study. And all of this information gets scattered throughout the organization and never gets looked at in a single place. I'll put my sales hat on for a second and tell you that that's one of the strengths of the Work Institute, is that as we're conducting this exit interview across the life cycle and as we're bringing all this data together, we have the ability to pull that into a single reporting place so that we can compare and contrast exit data, stay data, engagement data in ways that can be really meaningful, and we can look for correlations. So I would strongly urge you to look at all of these tools as being ways to have a pulsing mechanism so that if in fact things are changing quickly, we've got mechanisms in place to be able to get ongoing feedback. So we've got time for one more question that's been asked. Do you recommend the same process for a startup as opposed to an organization that's established? Absolutely. I mean, in the startup phase, it's the point in which you can build foundational culture and structure. That's, you know, it's absolutely vital that when we're starting up, we start things up right. So if we start with 5 employees or 10 employees or 15 employees, and we immediately embed employee voice into that culture, and certainly when you're small in a startup organization, you've got 5 or 6 employees, is that going to be as formal as what I presented? No, it's not. But if we can start to create those foundational items and create some level of formality to it, and even if it's internal, then we can start to build on what is it going to look like down the road. So we may have 5 employees today, 50 employees in 2 years, but 500 employees in 5 years. But the things that we start today, we hope that those survive through that process. And so I would absolutely encourage startup companies to build a structure similar to this. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I always like to end on time so that folks have committed an hour, and that's all that we want to take. I hope that you have gained some additional knowledge from this. I welcome your phone calls. I welcome your questions after the fact. If you just want to talk shop, it's one of the things that I love to do is just talk about HR, talk about the challenges that you're having. So you can easily find me here at the Work Institute. I think our contact information is here somewhere. Hold on. I think it's at the end. Yes, there's our contact information below. So feel free to give me a call. I'd be more than happy to talk to you about it. And if, in fact, you want to have an outside third party help you to develop a successful retention strategy, we would certainly be more than happy to help you in that process and talk about the different ways that we can use employee feedback to get to the best data possible to build an effective retention and engagement strategy. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the week, and join us next month for our next webinar. Thank you so much, everyone.